Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of The City in the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. Our hero Alvin and his mentor Kedron the Jester have found something crucially interesting at the center of an old map of Diaspar. Chapter 9. Alystra had found it very easy to follow Alvin and Kedron without their knowledge. They seemed in a great hurry, something which in itself was most unusual, and never looked back. It had been an amusing game to pursue them along the moving ways, hiding in the crowds yet always keeping them in sight. Toward the end of their goal, it had been obvious. When they left the pattern of the streets and went into the park, they could only be heading for the tomb of Yarlin Zay. The park contained no other buildings, and people in such eager haste as Alvin and Kedron would not be interested merely in enjoying the scenery. Because there was no way of concealing herself on the last few hundred yards to the tomb, Alystra waited until Kedron and Alvin had disappeared into the marbled gloom. Then, as soon as they were out of sight, she hurried up the grass-covered slope. She felt fairly sure that she could hide behind one of the great pillars long enough to discover what Alvin and Kedron were doing. It did not matter if they detected her after that. The tomb consisted of two concentric rings of columns enclosing a circular court. Except in one sector, the columns screened off the interior completely, and Alystra avoided approaching through this opening, but entered the tomb from the side. She cautiously negotiated the first ring of columns, saw that there was no one in sight, and tiptoed across to the second. Through the gaps she could see Yarlin Zay looking out through the entrance across the park he had built, and beyond that to the city over which he had watched for so many ages. And there was no one else in all this marble solitude. The tomb was empty. At that moment, Alvin and Kedron were 100 feet underground, in a small box-like room whose walls seemed to be flowing steadily upward. That was the only indication of movement. There was no trace of vibration to show that they were sinking swiftly into the earth, descending toward a goal that even now neither of them fully understood. It had been absurdly easy, for the way had been prepared for them. By whom, wondered Alvin? By the central computer? Or by Yarlin Zay himself when he transformed the city? The monitor screen had showed them the long vertical shaft plunging into the depths, but they had followed its course only a little way when the image blanked out. That meant, Alvin knew, that they were asking for information the monitor did not possess, perhaps had never possessed. He had scarcely framed this thought when the screen came to life once more. On it appeared a brief message, printed in the simplified script which machines had used to communicate with men ever since they had achieved intellectual equality. Stand where the statue gazes, and remember, Diaspar was not always thus. The last 5 words were in larger type, and the meaning of the entire message was obvious to Alvin at once. Mentally framed code messages had been used for ages to unlock doors or set machines in action. As for stand where the statue gazes, that was really too simple. I wonder how many people have read this message, said Alvin thoughtfully. 14, to my knowledge, replied Kedron, and there may have been others. He did not amplify this rather cryptic remark, and Alvin was in too great a hurry to reach the park to question him further. They could not be certain that the mechanisms would still respond to the triggering impulse. When they reached the tomb, it had taken them only a moment to locate the single slab among all those paving the floor upon which the gaze of Yarlin Zay was fixed. It was only at first sight that the statue seemed to be looking out across the city. If one stood directly in front of it, one could see that the eyes were downcast and that the elusive smile was directed toward a spot just inside the entrance to the tomb. Once the secret was realized, there could be no doubt about it. Alvin moved to the next slab and found that Yarlin Zay was no longer looking toward him. He rejoined Kedron and mentally echoed the words that the jester spoke aloud. Diaspar was not always thus. Instantly, as if the millions of years that had lapsed since their last operation had never existed, the waiting machines responded. The great slab of stone on which they were standing began to carry them smoothly into the depths. Overhead, the patch of blue suddenly flickered out of existence. The shaft was no longer open. There was no danger that anyone should accidentally tumble into it. Alvin wondered fleetingly if another slab of stone had somehow been materialized to replace the one now supporting him and Kedron, then decided against it. The original slab probably still paved the tomb. The one upon which they were standing might only exist for infinitesimal fractions of a second, being continuously recreated at greater and greater depths in the earth to give the illusion of steady downward movement. Neither Alvin nor Kedron spoke as the walls flowed silently past them. Kedron was once again wrestling with his conscience, wondering if this time he had gone too far. He could not imagine where this route might lead, if indeed it led anywhere. For the first time in his life, he began to understand the real meaning of fear. Alvin was not afraid. He was too excited. This was the sensation he had known in the Tower of Lorraine, when he had looked out across the untrodden desert and seen the stars conquering the night sky. He had merely gazed at the unknown then. He was being carried toward it now. The walls ceased to flow past them. A patch of light appeared at one side of their mysteriously moving room, grew brighter and brighter, and was suddenly a door. They stepped through it, took a few paces along the short corridor beyond, and then were standing in a great circular cavern whose walls came together in a sweeping curve 300 feet above their heads. The column down whose interior they had descended seemed far too slim to support the millions of tons of rock above it. Indeed, it did not seem to be an integral part of the chamber at all, but gave the impression of being an afterthought. Kedron, following Alvin's gaze, arrived at the same conclusion. This column, he said, speaking jerkily as if anxious to find something to say, was built simply to house the shaft down which we came. It could never have carried the traffic that must have passed through here when Diaspar was still open to the world. That came through those tunnels over there. I suppose you recognize what they are? Alvin looked toward the walls of the chamber more than 100 yards away. Piercing them at regular intervals were large tunnels, 12 of them, radiating in all directions exactly as the moving ways did today. He could see that they sloped gently upward, and now he recognized the familiar gray surface of the moving ways. These were only the severed stumps of the great roads. The strange material that gave them life was now frozen into immobility. When the park had been built, the hub of the moving way system had been buried, but it had never been destroyed. Alvin began to walk toward the nearest of the tunnels. He had gone only a few paces when he realized that something was happening to the ground beneath his feet. It was becoming transparent. A few more yards, and he seemed to be standing in mid-air without visible support. He stopped and stared down into the void beneath him. "Kedron," he called, "come and look at this." The other joined him, and together they gazed at the marvel beneath their feet. Faintly visible at an indefinite depth lay an enormous map, a great network of lines converging toward a spot beneath the central shaft. They stared at it in silence for a moment, then Kedron said quietly, "You realize what this is for?" "I think so," replied Alvin. "It's a map of the entire transport system, and those little circles must be the other cities of Earth. I can just see names beside them, but they're too faint to read." "There must have been some form of internal illumination once," said Kedron absently. He was tracing the lines beneath his feet, following them with his eyes out toward the walls of the chamber. "I thought so," he exclaimed suddenly. "Do you see how all these radiating lines lead toward the small tunnels?" Alvin had noticed that beside the great arches of the moving ways there were innumerable smaller tunnels leading out of the chamber, tunnels that sloped downward instead of up. Kedron continued without waiting for a reply. It would be hard to think of a simpler system. People would come down the moving ways, select the place they wish to visit, and then follow the appropriate line on the map. "And what happens to them after that?" asked Alvin. Kedron was silent, his eyes searching out the mystery of those descending tunnels. There were 30 or 40 of them, all looking exactly the same. Only the names on the map would have enabled one to distinguish between them, and those names were indecipherable now. Alvin had wandered away and was circumnavigating the central pillar. Presently his voice came to Kedron, slightly muffled and overlaid with echoes from the walls of the chamber. "What is it?" called Kedron, not wishing to move, as he had nearly succeeded in reading one of the dimly visible groups of characters. But Alvin's voice was insistent, so he went to join him. Far beneath was the other half of the great map, its faint webwork radiating to the points of the compass. This time, however, not all of it was too dim to be clearly seen, for one of the lines, and only one, was brilliantly illuminated. It seemed to have no connection with the rest of the system, and it pointed like a gleaming arrow to one of the downward-sloping tunnels. Near its end, the line transfixed a circle of golden light, and against this circle was the single word, "Lys." That was all. For a long time, Alvin and Kedron stood gazing down at that silent symbol. To Kedron, it was a challenge he knew he could never accept, and which, indeed, he would rather did not exist. But to Alvin it hinted at the fulfillment of all his dreams. Though the word "Lys" meant nothing to him, he let it roll around his mouth, tasting its sibilance like some exotic flavor. The blood was pounding in his veins, and his cheeks were flushed as by a fever. He stared around this great concourse, trying to imagine it as it had been in the ancient days, when air transport had come to an end, but the cities of Earth still had contact with one another. He thought of the countless millions of years that had passed with the traffic steadily dwindling and the lights on the great map dying one by one, until at last only this single line remained. How long, he wondered, had it gleamed there among its darkened companions, waiting to guide the steps that never came, until Jarl and Zay had sealed the moving ways and closed Diaspar against the world. And that must have been 1,000 million years ago. Even then, Lys must have lost contact with Diaspar. It seemed impossible that it could have survived. Perhaps, after all, the map meant nothing now. Kedron broke into his reverie at last. He seemed nervous and ill at ease, not at all like the confident and self-assured person he had always been in the city above. "I do not think we should go any further now," he said. "It may not be safe until we are more prepared." There was wisdom in this, but Alvin recognized the underlying note of fear in Kedron's voice. Had it not been for that, he might have been sensible, but a too acute awareness of his own valor, combined with his contempt for Kedron's timidity, drove Alvin onward. It seemed foolish to have come so far, only to turn back when the goal might be in sight. "I'm going down that tunnel," he said stubbornly, as if challenging Kedron to stop him. "I want to see where it leads." He set off resolutely, and after a moment's hesitation, the jester followed him along the arrow of light that burned beneath their feet. As they stepped into the tunnel, they felt the familiar tug of the peristaltic field, and in a moment were being swept effortlessly into the depths. The journey lasted scarcely a minute. When the field released them, they were standing at one end of a long, narrow chamber in the form of a half-cylinder. At its distant end, 2 dimly lit tunnels stretched away toward infinity. Men of almost every civilization that had existed since the dawn would have found their surroundings completely familiar, yet to Alvin and Kedron this was a glimpse of another world. The purpose of the long, streamlined machine that lay aimed like a projectile at the far tunnel was obvious, but that made it nonetheless novel. Its upper portion was transparent, and looking through the walls, Alvin could see rows of luxuriously appointed seats. There was no sign of any entrance, and the entire machine was floating about a foot above a single metal rod that stretched away into the distance, disappearing in one of the tunnels. A few yards away, another rod led into the second tunnel, but no machine floated above it. Alvin knew as surely as if he had been told that somewhere beneath unknown far-off lists, that second machine was waiting in another chamber such as this. Kedron began to talk, a little too swiftly. What a peculiar transport system. It could only handle 100 people at a time, so they could not have expected much traffic. And why did they go to all this trouble to bury themselves in the earth if the skies were still open? Perhaps the invaders would not even permit them to fly, though I find that hard to believe. Or was this built during the transition period when men still traveled but did not wish to be reminded of space? They could go from city to city and never see the sky and the stars. He gave a nervous laugh. I feel sure of one thing, Alvin. When Lys existed, it was much like Diaspar. All cities must be essentially the same. No wonder that they were all abandoned in the end and it merged into Diaspar. What was the point of having more than one? Alvin scarcely heard him. He was busy examining the long projectile, trying to find the entrance. If the machine was controlled by some mental or verbal order, he might never be able to make it obey him, and it would remain a maddening enigma for the rest of his life. The silently opening door took him completely unawares. There was no sound, no warning when a section of the wall simply faded from sight and the beautifully designed interior lay open before his eyes. This was the moment of choice. Until this instant, he had always been able to turn back if he wished. But if he stepped inside that welcoming door, he knew what would happen, though not where it would lead. He would no longer be in control of his own destiny, but would have placed himself in the keeping of unknown forces. He scarcely hesitated. He was afraid to hold back, being fearful that if he waited too long, this moment might never come again, or that if it did, his courage might not match his desire for knowledge. Kedron opened his mouth in anxious protest, but before he could speak, Alvin had stepped through the entrance. He turned to face Kedron, who was standing framed in the barely visible rectangle of the doorway, and for a moment there was a strained silence while each waited for the other to speak. The decision was made for them. There was a faint flicker of translucence, and all of the machine had closed again. Even as Alvin raised his hand in farewell, the long cylinder started to ease itself forward. Before it had entered the tunnel, it was already moving faster than a man could run. There had been a time when every day millions of men made such journeys in machines basically the same as this, as they shuttled between their homes and their humdrum jobs. Since that far-off day, man had explored the universe and returned again to Earth, had won an empire and had it wrested from his grasp. Now such a journey was being made again, in a machine wherein legions of forgotten and unadventurous men would have felt completely at home. And it was to be the most momentous journey any human being had undertaken for 1 billion years. Alystra had searched the tomb 12 times, though once was quite sufficient, for there was nowhere anyone could hide. After the first shock of surprise, she had wondered if she had followed across the park not Alvin and Kedron, but only their projections. But that made no sense. Projections were materialized at any spot one wished to visit without the trouble of going there in person. No sane person would have walked his projected image a couple of miles, taking half an hour to reach his destination when he could be there instantly. No, it was the real Alvin and the real Kedron that she had followed into the tomb. Somewhere, then, there must be a secret entrance. She might as well look for it while she was waiting for them to come back. As luck would have it, she missed Kedron's reappearance, for she was examining a column behind the statue when he emerged on the other side of it. She heard his footsteps, turned toward him, and saw at once that he was alone. "Where's Alvin?" she cried. It was some time before the jester answered. He looked distraught and irresolute, and Alystra had to repeat her question before he took any notice of her. He did not seem in the least surprised to find her here. "I do not know where he is," he answered at last. "I can only tell you that he is on his way to Lys. Now you know as much as I do." It was never wise to take Kedron's words at their face value, but Elystra needed no further assurance that the jester was not playing his role today. He was telling her the truth, whatever it might mean. And we will follow Alvin to Lys next time.